Dalia Fahmy is the Director of International Relations and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. She joins me now live from New York. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. I mean, not the first time we are mentioning the worsening humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. And time again, the international community has failed the people of Gaza. I want to ask you with one simple question. Is there any hope left for the Palestinians?
Well, Palestinians are a very resilient population. I think what we need to focus on is why has it been that since March 2nd, not a single humanitarian aid, food, medicine, or even petro that was used to before actually desalinize and clean water has been allowed to enter since March 2nd. And even in the report that you mentioned earlier that there's a plan put in place. Now, today, Doctors Without Borders or MSF issued a report on this plan and saying that this U.S.-Israel proposition to control the supply of Gaza through outsourced individuals is really problematic. And it's under the guise of humanitarian aid, but it actually leads to ethical and security and legal concerns because it's not going through the proper channels. Now, when we think about ultimately what's happening in this last round of negotiations, even the one that was announced, was that aid is being conditioned on forced displacement of a population. MSF, for example, has continued to reject and condemn this because what's happening is that Palestinians are subjected to new forms of repression. So, for example, what they're saying is that people that they've treated before are now coming back with new wounds, new effects of war. So you're seeing the population that has been victimized multiple times in terms of bombings, but also in terms of this prolonged starvation that's happening to the population, where today the United Nations reported that 500,000 people are on the brink of starvation. And so it continues to beg the question, why is it that although it violates UN Resolution 2720, that humanitarian aid continues to be conditional, and we haven't seen a single morsel enter Gaza since March 2nd?
I mean, I have to say it's a matter of shame for humanity, Dalia. Now, what would possibly bring this to an end? The negotiations have been taking place for a ceasefire, and all these negotiations have not produced any positive results. Now, there is talk that there's some sort of friction between the U.S. president and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Could that possibly lead us to a ceasefire in Gaza? Because, as everyone knows, if there is one country on this planet that could possibly influence Netanyahu into signing a ceasefire agreement, then that country is where you're joining me from.
So, you know, there was this glimmer of hope because the release, for example, of the American hostage was a negotiation between the United States and Hamas and not with the Israeli government. And so what we're starting to see is a sidestepping of the Israeli government by the U.S. administration. However, today, Steve Witkoff and President Trump actually did have talks with the delegation, the Israeli delegation in Doha. However, after the meeting, a statement was issued from the Israeli government saying that there are no indication from the talks that there's going to be any reason for optimism. And so while Steve Witkoff said that there is room for optimism, and President Trump has promised that he's not going to come back from the region without a peace deal, it's not clear that there are partners on this peace deal. Again, we do not know the details. However, even as Steve Witkoff says, there's great progress being made within the same hour. To see this statement issued from the Israeli government continues to be quite telling, to ask, well, who is it that's actually negotiating? Who's at the negotiating table? Is everyone a good faith negotiator? And what happens when you leave the negotiation table and then go back to your own corners and actually say the exact opposite? So it's not clear that there's a clear process. It's not clear that through the multiple rounds of negotiations I've been having for almost 18 months now, we're starting to see a pattern of behavior of those that backtrack on what was happening at the negotiation table.
So, Dalia, in light of what's been happening in Gaza right now, and especially in terms of negotiations, what do you think the future holds for the Gaza Strip?
It's hard to predict. What we do know is that 70% of it has been completely destroyed, uninhabitable, and has been declared almost a no-go zone by the Israeli government. So much of the population has been reduced to 30% of the strip. In that 30% of the strip, 90% of the buildings have been destroyed. And so what you have is 95% of the residents of Gaza have been displaced, either internally mainly or some externally. And so, in terms of what is left of Gaza, there really isn't anything. Everyone's life has been fundamentally affected. Every family has deaths, every family has trauma, and now folks have young people dying of hunger. We have to reiterate that not even baby formula is allowed to enter the Gaza Strip, not since March 2nd. And so, what's happening is this slow starving to death of a population, and we are witnessing on our cameras. And so it begs the question continuously of, what does this mean for the international rules-based world order, where population should not be harmed, and there's a right to protect. It seems that all of the norms of liberalism that we all agreed onto in the late 80s, early 90s are all being questioned today. And so this begs the question, not just what is happening in Gaza and what is the future of Gaza, but really what is the future of the international community in terms of position on the liberal rules-based world order and how we actually talk about human rights.
Fascinating insights. Dalia Fahmy, thanks very much for joining me here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time.
Thank you.